Wow. I'm going to take advantage of this lull in the chatter and start the meetup. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Great to see everyone. My name is Jonathan, and me and Lindsay, who is somewhere in the crowd, we're the co-organizers of the Toronto Modern Data Stack Meetup. So first off, thanks everybody for coming. Round of applause. So we have an incredible lineup of speakers today. And I'm going to introduce them in a second. But first, thanks to Astronomer for sponsoring this event. If you don't know Astronomer, they're a cloud-managed version, or cloud-hosted Airflow. And if you don't know Airflow, you will definitely know what Airflow is by the end of tonight. Big thanks to them for the food, the drinks, and small things as well along the way. So today we're going to have 3 talks, and then we'll do, I'll share the event survey with you, and do a call for speakers, and then we will make our way to the pub for some post-meetup drinks. So we have some space at the Friar, which I think is just down the street. And so we'll be able to just go there, have a couple of drinks, let loose. It'll be a good time. So to start off, Lindsay is my co-organizer. She's at Maple. I myself am on the data team here at Super. This is our third meetup, or third or fourth meetup. And, we try to do these every month and a half, every 2 months. We're always looking for people's advice. So if you want to just find me or Lindsay at the end of this and tell us what you think about the talks, about, if you want to talk yourself or do something like that. Happy to chat, and it's really great to just hear the feedback about these events. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. So I have some notes prepared here. Okay, let's start off with Evelyn Wainewright. So Evelyn runs a data consulting practice and is the technical co-founder at Hyperscale, helping businesses use data to optimize their marketing efforts. Evelyn has spent the last 7 years starting and scaling data teams in both full-time and fractional roles, and she has transitioned throughout her career from leading data teams to leading teams across the business, including marketing, design, operations, and GM roles. Evelyn focuses on pragmatic solutions to business problems and making sure companies are getting the best ROI out of their data. So if you're in the data world and you're wondering, how do I progress in my career? I think Evelyn will present to you a couple different tracks that go beyond just this chief data officer or CIO or something that data folks might feel that they're normally confined to. So really excited about this talk. And I'll just do all the intros now to speed things up. Viraj, who we have here from New York, is one of the co-founders of Astronomer and based in Brooklyn. At Astronomer, he helps with everything related to the data ecosystem around Airflow, and he's going to share a lot about what he's learned and what he knows with us later in his talk. And in his spare time, he enjoys playing chess and watching the New York Knicks, which is this year actually quite a pleasure to do. And finally, we have Michelle. Michelle Ark is the staff engineer for DBT Core at DBT Labs, and previously she was an engineer at Shopify working on the team that implemented DBT there and launched it throughout the organization. You may remember her from our fall meetup where she presented some lessons learned from 2 years of DBT at Shopify with Daniel Cole, and she's going to talk about what we can expect to see coming out of DBT in the next few releases. Cool. So I'm going to kick it off to Evelyn. Let's get a round of applause.
Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so let's talk about career growth and career flexibility as a data analyst. So to kind of preface this and just state my own bias, I am firmly about the belief that having a role in a data team gives you an incredible opportunity to learn about everything in the business because you touch the data from basically every team in the business. And so if I think back to my own career, I've kind of used that to pivot into and out of data roles throughout my journey. And going through that, I want to focus on some of the non-technical skills that are needed to do that. I think we're going to hear some great technical talks later, which I'm very excited about. But wanted to kind of give you some frameworks about how to develop some of those skills that'll allow you to both emphasize the value of the work that you're doing in a data team, but also potentially expand beyond a data team, if that's something that you're interested in doing. And we're going to do that through an exercise that you can do tomorrow if you want to with your company, and we'll walk through how that helps you with those skill sets. So without further ado, let's chat about data career paths. So typically when we talk about data career paths, we see some of these types of models. People start as an analyst and then try to move into like a scientist, analyst engineer, or data engineer role. And I'm just gonna make a quick note that, just a personal note here, there is nothing wrong with staying as a data analyst for your entire career. There's a ton of value you can add there. There is not a necessity to move to those roles, but often we hear career paths kind of talked about this way. And then we're all really familiar with kind of the two routes you have from there. You can people manage, or you can be a really senior IC, both of which are super valuable tracks. And I think both tracks are generally well understood in the data sphere, or becoming pretty well understood. And so I'm not going to focus on that. I think there's lots of materials out there. What I am instead going to look at is in my own career journey, I have had times as I've gone through my career where I have followed that data track. Data scientist, manager, director, whatever that looks like. But then as I reflect, I've also had these like weird curveballs where I went from being a data scientist to leading an 8-person marketing and sales ops team, for example, or being a director of data science to running one of our business lines, to then being a GM and running, as Jonathan mentioned in my intro, marketing, ops, creative, data, and the business line for the company. And so having done that through my career, and I now split my time between 2 companies that I am the founder or co-founder of, Hyperscale, which is a SaaS platform we'll talk about a little bit later, and then I have a business where we do data consulting, addressing most of the problems that I've had to address throughout my career up until this point, whether that's hiring and managing teams, coaching data managers, or ripping out old infrastructure and putting in a modern data stack. There are lots of skills that kind of give you the flexibility in either way to kind of lean into these types of roles. So I wanted to distill that down to kind of 3 key steps. And I think about this both when I think about applying for a new role or starting a new role, and in my consulting practice, I think about this when I think about looking at new clients and talking to new clients. And so the first thing is to learn as much as you can about the business. That feels obvious, but it can get kind of lost in the chaos of starting a new role. And so what I want to do is give you a framework for how to do that so that you can do that a little bit more systematically. Once you have learned everything you can about the business, for me, and especially in my career, I have prioritized solving problems and writing business value far above sticking to a job description. So if you can identify the problems that need to be solved, whether or not that is typically what a data scientist, analyst, engineer, whatever your title is, does, solve that problem, right? That is the fastest way for you to learn. And then it's the fastest way for you to add business value. And that brings us to the third step. When you add that business value, communicate and over-communicate to make sure people know how what you're doing is solving their problems. And this is one that I like to focus on because I think as data people, we have our own sort of technical language that we have to speak to each other. We also, I think, have to translate that language to the rest of the business. And so I want to go through an exercise that I think gives you a framework to do all 3 of these things that will allow you to kind of frame what you're doing in a way that makes sense across the business. So that exercise is going to be called a KPI tree or a money tree, it might be explained. We're going to walk through it together, and then we're going to walk through some of the applications of that and how it can relate to your role. And we're going to do that using an example business, which is Hyperscale. So I mentioned earlier, that's the SaaS business that I run. We're going to use it as an example because I have permission to share those numbers versus some of my client stats. It's also quite a simple business, and so what we do at Hyperscale, we're in a closed beta right now. We're about to release a public beta, but we allow people to connect to their Facebook ads account, and we give them actionable insights as to how to optimize their spend. So if you think about my career as data and marketing, it's a product that does data and marketing together. What you can tell from just what I've described, and maybe looking at like a landing page, you can pull out some really key pieces of a business. And this is the process that I would go through if I was interviewing with a business or if I was looking at them as a potential client. So it's a subscription-based business. We'll chat about subscription metrics, but I'll give you some examples of where that might be flexible if you're not looking at a subscription business. For us, we have a 1-week trial, after which point we look for a conversion to clients, to paying clients. Our pricing is quite straightforward. It's 1.5% of ad spend. We don't have tiers, but we'll talk about the flexibility of what it would look like if you had a more complex pricing model. And then our sales process is also very simple. It's a landing page to the trial, but we'll talk about how to extend this exercise if you had like a sales team in a more complex process, either way. So without further ado, let's get into our exercise. So a KPI tree starts with the KPI that you care most about at the very top. For most for-profit businesses, it is profit. Depending on the business that you're running, the scale that you're at, the strategic priorities, it might be something different. It might be total revenue, it might be total number of customers, it might be EBITDA as opposed to profit. That can vary depending on your business. If you are in a meeting and your whole team cannot align on what is the most important metric for your business, you have just learned something very, very important, which is that there is not clarity in your org as to what you are doing. And that sounds obvious. It happens far more frequently than you expect. And so even just drawing these 3 boxes on a circle, or these 3 circles on a page, forces you to have the conversation with the right people about what are we actually trying to do here. Is it profit? Is it revenue? Is it number of customers? Is it EBITDA? Is it profit margins? What are we optimizing for? Why do we care about it? From there, in a KPI tree, we break it down. So each level as we go down, we just look at the formula or the inputs into that metric. So profit is revenue minus expenses. I'm hopefully not blowing anybody's mind here. This is obviously quite simple, but we can keep breaking it down. So expenses, we can look at, I'm gonna keep it really simple here. I'm gonna say cost of goods sold. For a subscription business, that might be things like your Stripe fees, it might be your infrastructure. Hopefully for a software company, there's not a ton more than that, but maybe you have some other tools you need to pay for, things like that. We're gonna say salaries and marketing. There's obviously other things that you might be including, like rent and overhead and lots of other things, but again, we're gonna keep it simple in this exercise. On the revenue side, we can say for a subscription business, this is revenue per subscription times the number of subscriptions sold. Again, this is a pretty common model. If you were selling like an e-commerce business, it'd be products, price per product times products sold. You can keep going. But revenue per subscription and numbers of subscriptions we can keep breaking down. And so we want to continue that exercise. In our case, we have our subscription price, that 1.5% times the ad spend for those customers. For the number of subscriptions, we would have returning subscribers and new subscribers. We can keep going. I'm going to do this a number of times, so I apologize. We can break down returning subscribers into last month's times your churn or your retention rate. You can break out new subscribers into your trial signups times your trial conversion rate. And then for us, we have a really simple flow here. For trial signups, it's visitors to the landing page times landing page conversion rate. If you had a sales team, this might be things like demos booked, demos attended, contracts out, contracts signed. You'd break out the conversion rate at each stage. I'm going to pause here. It's easy to kind of walk through this and think that every single step here is pretty self-explanatory, especially when it's already written out. But it doesn't look like anything groundbreaking. And that's fair. It's not. What is really, really useful, one, is that you have a single-page explanation of how a company makes its money. Every leaf, which is these pieces that are highlighted in red, so things at the very ends of all the arrows, are all the levers that you have to increase your key KPI in the business. If you want to increase profit, you can go after larger clients. If you want to increase profit, you can increase your landing page conversion rate. You can keep going through. From here, going through this exercise with your team, you'll have all the conversations about why this isn't actually the way we think about it. You should actually do this other thing instead. And that's so you understand that there's alignment across your team, that they all think about the business the same way. So I've done this in companies where sales and marketing had completely different views on how a customer actually became a customer, for example. And going through this process forced the conversation so that we understood that, hey, the sales team and the marketing team actually aren't talking as much as they need to. They don't understand how their funnels overlap. And it solves those problems. The second thing that we go through, and from a data perspective especially, we start at profit. Every company, by and large, knows what their profit is. We go to revenue and expenses. Every company, by and large, knows what their revenue and expenses are. But eventually, you start working your way through the tree, you start to notice where the blind spots are. And so this, as a data team, is where your company, your teams are lacking visibility. So if you're thinking about which metrics should I be focusing on exposing to my teams, where do we need to invest more in our data infrastructure, it's a combination of which of these areas is the business most focused on, and where do we not have clear understanding of what these metrics are. And so your business might be saying, look, we have a huge problem with churn, but we don't know what goes into that, for example. Or, we're not getting any new subscribers. How do we solve that problem? And so having these conversations around this, and then actually going through and matching the data to it. Where do we have these metrics? What are they? How do they compare to industry benchmarks? Is how you can start to identify the best places for you as a data person to be focusing. And this is really how I think about learning about a business in a holistic sense. How do I really quickly get a mental framework for what is a business? How do they make money? Where are they struggling? Where do they not have visibility into their analytics? So we talked about the first step being learn everything. I think there's a question there.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just curious, do you ever explode out the expense side, or do you primarily just focus on the revenue side?
So for this exercise, I don't, but for a full exercise that I was doing with a client, I would absolutely explode out the expenses side. Yeah. At some point, I had to spit on the slide. And I personally am not super driven by finance, and I sometimes find that boring to talk about, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah, no, I was kind of curious.
Yeah, it's super important, obviously, and marketing is a really deceptive one that's kind of thrown in there, especially because that really is linked to visitors to landing page is ad spend, it's lots of things. And that's actually, so there's a really small point here, which there's a bit of an art to knowing when to stop as well, because a lot of these you can keep going kind of ad nauseum. And so typically we're stopping in the kind of rule of thumb that I have is that we stop when we stop having the ability to operate or execute on strategies at that level. So if you have a really strong marketing team, I would absolutely expand that out into individual marketing channels, for example. If you are not going to change your subscription model, you will never do that because you don't have the capacity in your team. It's not going to happen. I'd probably leave it here. But this is where if I had multiple subscription prices, I'd be testing them in that place, for example. So as a math person, my math brain is but I can keep going. It's not technically complete yet. And this is where the operations hat falls in, and you say, okay, but if we can't action it, it's not worth going. It's just going to add complexity. So I match it to the team that you have at that time. And then as things start to become problems, that tells you your team needs to evolve. Your model has to evolve hand in hand. So we talked about this is how you learn, and this is literally it's a single page. It's a whiteboard session that you can do with your team tomorrow if you want to. It identifies where there are gaps in alignment, identifies where there's gaps in your analytics, and it hopefully tells you where are the biggest challenges in the business. What this also lets you do is forecast. So exactly this model that we just built, you can translate line for line into a Google Sheets, Excel, whatever forecast that you want. So you start from the top, profit, one tab in, revenue and expenses, one tab in, you keep going down. And all those pieces that are highlighted in red are your assumptions or your inputs into that model, and those are in blue along your model. Everything above the red is a calculation. So again, the benefit of having done this exercise with your team is that you don't need to have a conversation about how the model should be structured. You already have agreed on that. This is literally just translating it from an image to a Google Sheet. And images people tend to understand better. Google Sheets tend to be preferred by basically math and finance people and nobody else. So this is a way you can communicate to people who are not super into all the spreadsheets. Once you've got this column down, you pull it across 24 columns and you've got a 2-year roadmap. Now, the mathematics of the roadmap are very easy. The actual forecast is very difficult, but the value comes from the conversations about how do those blue inputs change. If we are putting a ton of time into our churn rate initiatives in Q2, what do we think that'll have? What impact do we think that'll have on the metrics over time that we expect? And having set that as a baseline, you can use that to measure progress, and the earlier you are, the more wildly inaccurate you're going to be, but it's forcing the right conversations in the business about what should you be prioritizing. And we talked about focusing on the right problems to solve as a data person, and doing this exercise means you have super clear visibility into what does the business care most about right now, and if you're forecasting into the future. So you can be thinking this whole time, what do I need, how can I apply the skills that I have to solve these problems, whether or not they would be traditionally considered data problems. So for me, in my roles, it was often looking at like, okay, we've got all this work coming up. In our marketing, for example, there's really a gap in attribution. How do we look at marketing tools that we need to have better attribution? And that was one of the ways that I kind of pivoted out of data and into marketing, was looking at that as a stepping stone, and then we kind of continued through that process. So there's big gaps in how our leads are dropping off from our marketing to our sales team. How do we automate some of those flows? And automating leads going from a marketing tool to a sales tool is probably not a traditional data scientist job definition, but it's close enough to the tools I already understood. It's an automation task. It's an easy, natural step. Okay, so you've forecasted with this. You can take that exact same model and you can prioritize with it. So your first column is your base case. You understand how each of these metrics work across your org and what you've now measured them, so you know what they are at each step. And then you just copy that column twice and you create two scenarios. For example, if you're trying to prioritize between two different sets of work that you might need to do. So in our first scenario, we're gonna run an experiment where we're gonna increase our pricing from 1.5% to 2%, and these numbers are obviously quite fake, for the record. But we think that increasing the pricing will decrease our trial conversion rate, right? So those two cells that are highlighted in red. If I do that, what's the difference to my key metric, my profit, in that scenario? In this case, pretty negligible compared to the total profit. And so, is it worth doing this? Especially if I don't have super high confidence that that trial conversion rate is accurate. What if it's even a little bit lower? Would I lose money doing this? If I don't see a clear win, maybe I need to rethink that experiment or rethink whether it's worth prioritizing. Let's say the second example is that our marketing team, who at $0 has been doing word of mouth marketing only so far, they get an opportunity to run an ad in some sponsored content piece for $5,000. They're super confident it'll drive 20,000 visitors to the site. They think the visitors are super aligned to their target audience, so no change in conversion rate. What would the impact be? Well, that's going to more than double our profit. Even if the margin of error, even if that estimate is incorrect, still probably worth at least trying it, right? And then you kind of built in your testing parameters. So this is exactly what your assumptions are about the test. You can go back afterwards and compare how did it actually do, and you start that iterative process of learning, okay, what was wrong about our assumptions, because something will be wrong, and how do we make better assumptions going forwards. And so as we think about how to prioritize the work that the whole team is doing, you can use this as a model. And again, having everybody align on the visual of it first means it's very easy to get alignment across the team that this is the right set of KPIs to look at when you're evaluating experiments as well. So you kind of bypass that initial discussion of, well, I think we should be measuring based on X, Y, and Z. We've already aligned. This is how we're measuring things. Okay, so we've learned everything about the business. We've identified gaps for our data team potentially to look into. We have built forecasts. We are prioritizing different ways to spend time as a team. You can do the same thing to spend time as a data team, obviously. Should I be giving more insight to the product team or the marketing team, who needs it more, who has bigger impact? Same concepts if you have limited resources, as we all do, focusing on the entire company, as most of us are. And as you start to do that prioritization on your data team, it becomes the question of, once you actually do this work, how do you communicate it? So I think there's a little bit of a tendency as data people to explain what I did. I built a churn model, and then I might go into more detail about this churn model that I'm super excited about. This is where we need to translate our work for the rest of the business. And so going back to this image, you start with which metric that impact, and then if the business understands the impact, you can leave it there. If it doesn't, you can just keep working your way up that chain to explain your impact. So instead of I built a churn model, I built a tool to lower churn. That's the value add that's here. And if everybody understands that, that's great. If you need to, you can be a little bit further to increase our returning subscribers, to increase our revenue, for example. And then you can explain how it works. That's typically people's next question, by flagging at-risk subscribers for the CX team so they can proactively reach out. And that's kind of the end of the sentence. The only extra thing I would add is if you've already implemented it, add the results. And it successfully reduced churn by this percent, right? This piece feels obvious to a lot of people when I present it. Well, of course I would work on a churn model to lower churn and increase revenue, right? Why else would you work on a churn model? But that's an assumption that's not always safe to make, that everybody else is making those connections for you. You have a lot of context onto the work that you're doing. Most people don't have that context in the work that you're doing. And so this is when I talk about over-communicating, sometimes explaining things that you think is very obvious. Because it's just a bit of a risk to assume that everybody else understands it the same way. And so flipping the language to be, I addressed this problem for the business by doing this thing that's very easy to understand, and it had this impact, as opposed to, I did this technical thing, right? These sessions, when we're all in the same language, we're all in the same background, talk about the technical thing. I'm super excited to hear about it. When I'm talking to the CEO, probably not the case. The next topic you can use to talk about in terms of how you communicate, we need budget. Great one. I need to ask for money, for example. Same concept, right? As opposed to I need to pay for Segment or Mixpanel or some other tool, I need to solve this problem for the business, right? Landing page conversion rates are really low. We need better visibility into it so that we can fix that hole in our funnel. That'll increase our revenue. You'll notice here, at no point do I mention budget in that statement, right? What I'm doing is aligning that we're solving the right problem and that I have their trust that I will solve that problem. I've identified the problem, I've proposed a solution. We all agree that the solution will fix this problem. After that's aligned, then comes the little 1-2 punch of like, and it'll only cost this amount, right? Especially if you can quantify the revenue impact. Would you like $100,000 more revenue and it'll only cost you $30,000? Yes, I would, right? But I need $30,000 for a segment is a very different conversation to start off with. And so, again, focus on whatever KPI you're improving, tie it back to that very top of your tree, and then at the very end, once you're already aligned, you've already had those conversations, then hit them with the cost, the wonderful part at the end. And talking about budget, this also works for raises or promotions, right? I shouldn't get promoted because I learned this new technical skill. I should be promoted because I had this business impact, fundamentally, right? I fully believe every company I've worked at has cared about my career development. None of them are paying me to develop my career, right? They're paying for me to have better impact in the business, fundamentally. So if I'm coming in for a raise conversation, I'm talking about where was I working that had impact, what was that impact, and then why should you continue to pay me or pay me more to continue to drive more of that impact. Maybe you and your manager understand the technical skills. Almost guarantee your CEO does not care, right? So give your manager's manager a really clear line to explain why we need this person on our team for the rest of time, right? Okay, so we have talked about a single exercise, that KPI tree that you can design. It will give you a one-pager on what the business does, how they make money, where there are gaps in their analytics, whether or not there's alignment across the team on how those things are understood. We've talked about translating that into a model that will allow you to prioritize and compare different opportunities, and it will also allow you to prioritize and compare work that you can do as an analyst to support the business. And we've talked about communicating that value back. And if you're doing all three of these things, you are naturally finding opportunities to flex outside of your role. And so in doing that, in having those one-on-one relationships with each of these teams and focusing on solving their problems, you're giving yourself opportunities to develop skill sets outside of a traditional, very linear data career. And so my very last key that I'm going to end on, which I think is very critical, and all this kind of boils down to, is it also lets you find your people. So careers are not created by a single person, certainly myself included, but doing this work forces you to work with everybody across the business. You're going to learn who you can learn from. You're going to teach people across the business. You're going to build trust. You're going to build respect. You're going to find your coaches and your mentors and the peers that you learn from. And I think that at its core is what allows you to take those chances, to build trust that people will take the chance on you and to continue to expand. So that is 7 years of experience summarized in 20 minutes. If there are any questions, let me know. Yeah. Do we pass the mic? I don't know what the process is.
Questions? No? Questions?
Yeah, there's one here.
Yeah. Just speak your
Two-part question.
Yeah.
And I want to preface by saying I also don't think there's anything wrong with being data analysts.
Yes.
Having said that, what you notice is that a lot of data scientists in the field, they're somewhat of a glorified data analyst.
Yeah.
Right. So, as a data scientist yourself, how did you distinguish yourself as
Yeah, it's a great question. Did everybody hear the question? Yes, okay, I'm seeing nods in this back corner, so that's good. So I'm going to answer it very, very transparently. I genuinely was a glorified data analyst with a data science title. So I didn't distinguish myself as a data scientist in my roles. But I want to talk about why that was. So for me, I pursued that title mostly because of the pay discrepancy between an analyst and a data scientist. Full transparency. Then I tried to prove my business value either way. So it justified the pay that they were giving me as a data scientist, whether or not what I was doing was fitting the definition of a data scientist. So realistically, if I go back years in my career, I probably should have been titled an analytics engineer fundamentally throughout those roles, realistically, in terms of what I was doing. But my focus was on how do I make this so that I feel it's fair for both me and the business, that my compensation reflects the value that I am providing. And at that time in my career, certainly there was a very big discrepancy, and analytics engineer didn't really exist between analyst and scientist. So that's a very, very transparent, very honest answer as to why that situation happened. And that is essentially how I would solve that going forwards, is that I also, as I started building data teams, created a lot more equalization of salary between those roles. And so for our teams that I would run, we would have basically like levels of like, we didn't call them junior, intermediate, senior, but like level 1, 2, 3, 4. Data analytics engineer, data scientist, data analyst all had the same pay bands at their respective levels. And so what we did was we allowed people to focus on the skill sets that were driving value and paid according to that. And the way we did that fundamentally was bumping up analyst salaries into the data science range. So that's the answer that I have for that, is that I would like to pay people on their value and let them have titles based on what skills they bring to their role day to day. And I believe that that is equalizing. Yeah. Yes.
How would you think about bringing up that conversation with your leadership team? So I think like it looks amazing on the slide and it's all built out, but it's almost kind of like, then how do you kind of broach that conversation to bring that into your senior executive team and then get their buy-in? Because I think they probably want to have an opinion about how the business works and have feedback on it. So what do you think is like kind of opening that door?
Yeah. So I like to start with your first level, like whoever your direct line senior executive is. So if you report into the COO, if you report into the CMO, whatever that looks like, and start with just a whiteboard exercise with them. Like, hey, I've been bouncing these ideas. I'm thinking about this as a conceptual model. Do you agree that this is how the business works? Right? And it literally takes like 15 minutes to just write it down on a whiteboard, digital or in person, and then get their feedback. Do you think that the rest of the team agrees with this? And if they say yes, then it's a natural question like, cool, can we do this exercise together and can we just get sign off that this is the right model? And then hopefully it's a pretty smooth conversation. You might find some discrepancies and some surprises, but you've at least aligned with some of the people in the room that this is probably the right model. I would also personally spend some time thinking about what other possibilities could exist. Fundamentally, you're mapping mathematical equations that can be rearranged, so you can write them in any order and they're still mathematically true. And so you're also trying to find a bit of a subjective view of how does the business think about this. And so kind of doing that exercise yourself, so you have, here's how I can pivot if I hear some of these things might be helpful, just to feel confident in that meeting. But start with one person, maybe two on that team, build alignment there, and then broach it with the rest of the team. If they come back and say, I don't think this is how the rest of the business sees it, then that's a great time to be like, hey, can we do this exercise? Can we literally start at profit? And then we're gonna hash it out each line, and we're gonna talk about the trade-offs between them until there is alignment in the room. Yep.
How do you find your people? Teammates, and also how do you find your clients?
Okay, so for finding people that I work with, and I'll answer work for after, at this point in my career, I'm doing a lot of kind of like direct referrals. So people I've worked with in the past who are then saying like, hey, I heard you were doing this. I think this person would be great. Let's kind of continue those conversations. When I was hiring for full-time roles, I would work with our talent acquisition teams. Realistically, I don't have that luxury anymore. And so the next best thing for me is these types of events. It's absolutely an answer to that. The tools that I work with in my technology roles, both, are often very aligned to these types of events. So DBT, Tran, BigQuery, Looker, all the things you'd expect to hear. Astronomer, I'm hoping soon, so I'm really curious about your talk next. So these are ones where you find kind of where people are gathering. For me, I also have hired pretty extensively. So we talked a lot about how to move out of data. I've hired pretty extensively people moving into data. So somebody with a marketing background who wants to become a marketing analyst, for example. I have a bit of a personal belief that it's a lot easier to teach SQL than it is to teach marketing, for example. And so I'd rather somebody who already understands why attribution is important and different models, and then I just need to teach them how to implement it in SQL, for example. So I've had a lot of success hiring from people from like a marketing operations, finance background as well. Usually that's like coaching them through like a lateral move in a company already. It's like I've already worked with them, they have contacts in the business, it's an easier transition. But sometimes it's also hiring out of those roles and somebody who's just super motivated to learn SQL, applies for their first data job, and we kind of take a chance and go from there. And it's been also a really successful path. In terms of getting clients, a lot of the same answers, a lot of word of mouth, a lot of events. So a lot of companies who, they talk about, we want to solve this problem, and somebody in the room says, oh, I ran into somebody who solved that problem. Here's her number, type of thing. Yeah. All right, yes?
Yeah, I've got like a really practical question.
Yeah.
KPI tree. I'm immediately doing it in my head, right?
Yeah, of course.
And so, like, in your experience, how do you think about fixed costs versus variable costs? It's like unit costs, like variable costs in the expense column.
Yes.
In my mind, I immediately threw it in the revenue column.
Yeah.
And so, like, how have you normally worked through that?
Yep.
How do you think about that?
So there's kind of two implicit questions. If I go back to this slide, it's where does it fit in this diagram? And there's also kind of a question of like where does it fit in like a model proper, so like left and right. Right is easier because you link them, obviously, so your variable costs are linked to your inputs that are variable, and so that's maybe more straightforward. So if your COGS is actually, let's say, Stripe expenses are a percentage of your revenue, then you link that as a percentage of your revenue, right? In this diagram, I find it's often easier for people to conceptually separate them this way. And then the exception that I will make is that if your variable costs are a significant portion, more than like a 3% Stripe fee, then I might actually, I rearrange the diagram and I just make them so they're very close, and I have the kind of the two arrows linking to those metrics that meet in the middle for those. Yeah. All right.
Another round of applause. Yeah, I think you'll probably stick around a bit after.
Yes, I
and
will.
if people have more questions, because I know I myself in my head was like, wow, tomorrow I should go build a KPI tree for my company. I mean, I won't, but I should.
It's like in 10 minutes you do before you leave.
Yeah. I'll think about it. But yeah, that was awesome. Really, really, really good stuff. And let's just get straight into the next one. So Viraj is here, and he's going to tell us about how Airflow is a foundational layer, and I'm really excited for this. Oh, and for questions, let's actually do questions for the record.
Awesome. Well, I have the displeasure of trying to follow that one up, so next time I have to go first or last, no one remembers. But anyways, thank you all so much for coming out. I want to talk to you all about kind of some things around how Apache Airflow as a project is changing and what that means for kind of everyone in the community. But before I get started, like, how many people have heard of Apache Airflow kind of in the crowd? Awesome. All right. So I'm going to assume some level of base knowledge about it. If I skip over something or something kind of goes, feel free to like raise your hand and stop me. And also I'll be around after, so happy to chat after. But a little about us. We're Astronomer. We're the company behind Apache Airflow. We have a cloud service for it. Think Databricks, Spark, Confluent Kafka, Astronomer Airflow. And if anyone's looking to learn it, we just kind of redid our whole Academy site. So this gives you a free certification and a free exam. Please feel free to check it out. And I think these slides will be linked out afterwards, so don't feel the need to make sure you spell everything right if you're writing it down or whatnot. And then last but not least, Airflow Summit is going to be in Toronto this year. This is why I was here earlier. I was kind of picking the venue and all that stuff, but it's later in September. If your team uses Airflow at all, we highly recommend, or I would highly hope that you submit a talk. And we're hoping to have around 600 people there. It's going to be at one of the Marriott's, like, I think half an hour walking, so like a mile and a half that way. Yeah, but in late September. Awesome. So really high level overview on Airflow. Founded in 2014, it is a tool to author data pipelines. It expresses data pipelines as DAGs, or directed acyclic graphs, and that's just a fancy way of saying, hey, this thing has a start and an end and a defined order along the way. And kind of as a result of that, right, because it's purely Python-based, we've seen some people do some really interesting things with it. It powers data pipelines for places like Airbnb, Lyft, Snowflake, etc. And the community stats on it are pretty insane. I think these are actually a little outdated. We're at like 13 million downloads a month. The Slack community is at like 30,000. But one way or another, big community, lots of people, kind of tried and tested because it's been around since 2014. But if you kind of spend some time on Twitter, I don't know why you would do that, or kind of Googling around for Airflow, you'll find what I call like a lot of Airflow hate, right? And things like, hey, you can't use it for that, or hey, it's just cron on steroids, or hey, like it was good enough in 2015, but it's not good enough today. I find these things, like that one especially, pretty funny and entertaining, but also kind of heartbreaking, because a lot of it is kind of outdated in the sense that, like, especially since early 2021, late 2021, we've been kind of pushing out releases every 2 or so weeks. One of the benefits of having a huge open source community with several commercial vendors behind it is that you can really have a tried and tested release process, which means you get new features all the time. Unfortunately, upgrading Airflow isn't super easy, which makes it so that sometimes someone will get frustrated with it, write a blog post about how shitty it is, and then I'll have to like respectfully say, hey, like, I'm sorry, but that's not really true anymore. Like, sorry about your experience, happy to help, blah, blah, blah. So there's a couple of misconceptions here. Someone in the community wrote this, and I don't want to go through kind of every single thing in this article, but there was one thing that really caught my eye. And that's kind of this idea that you can't look at Airflow itself, right? Like, I can talk to you about community metrics and how good they are, but I'd be lying to you if I didn't say, like, they're kind of vanity metrics, right? Like, what does that even mean? But what you can't really fake, there's no real vanity around, it's when an open source project serves as a foundation for other things. If you look at Postgres or Flask, like, I don't know what the metrics around those are, but it's very clear that those are tried and true standards because people build on top of them. And coming from my perspective at Astronomer, just being there for a very long time at this point, it's been really awesome to see what people are building on top of Airflow and what that's kind of given data teams the ability to do. So I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. Cool. So one thing that Airflow's added recently, and I'm going to talk about this feature, and then I'm going to talk about how people build on top of this feature for more opinionated frameworks, is data-driven scheduling. I could probably talk the entire talk about this. I've given talks about this, but the TLDR is, hey, you have a function that's part of a DAG. It's a discrete step in your workflow, and you mark it as a producer. And then a downstream workflow can actually take that as an input and use it as a consumer. So now instead of saying, hey, run this over here, and then 3 hours later run this over there, you can say, hey, just run this other workflow when my data arrives. It's kind of this whole new abstraction where you don't just have to think about your workflows in a matter of cron syntax or batch syntax. It's data-driven. You get to say, run this when the data arrives. And that data can be a DBT job finishing, that can be a 5-trans sync finishing, a stitch job finishing. It's kind of whatever it likes, because Airflow is very unopinionated. And because it's unopinionated, you can do a lot with it. And what I've really seen is Airflow is this really strong foundation in open source that gives you these things to build on. You have this abstraction for DAGs, pipelines as code. You have all the scheduling APIs you need, be it cron syntax or this new data-driven syntax. You have a huge community of users and integrations. And coming in Airflow 2.6, which I think is like 2 weeks away, is this new notion of setup and teardown tasks. So that's something where you can say, hey, as soon as this finishes, get rid of this EMR cluster, or make sure all the temp tables in Snowflake get deleted, or what have you. I can talk a lot more about that as well. Find me after if that's interesting to you. But don't think of it as a feature that you need to kind of compare against something else. Think of it as a foundational piece to build on. And what we've seen is all these really, really interesting frameworks built on top of Airflow that really give it use case specific things that you can pip install like any other Python library. So just going through a few of these, the folks over at Metaflow and ZenML, if you're a machine learning person or machine learning ops person, have written things to make it so you can take a very hyperparameter tuning or like any machine learning specific sort of workflow and export it into an Airflow DAG, and then run that with Airflow with all these abstractions around scheduling, error notifications, and so on and so forth. This cool company called LineaPy, they wrote this pandas extension that says, hey, take your pandas code that you use to manipulate a data frame and automatically turn it into a DAG. Super, super cool. There's a whole bunch of things around making it so that you can take a YAML file and turn that into an Airflow DAG, get lineage out of Airflow. But one that I want to talk about today, because it kind of shamelessly started as a hackathon project at Astronomer's hackathon a few weeks back, is something called Cosmos, which says, hey, you over there, you're a DAG. I'm going to pull you and put you into Airflow. So the most common use case we've seen with people doing this is with dbt core. And dbt core with Cosmos really turns Airflow into it's really a great experience for users. So as a show of hands, like how many people do something like this on their data team, where they have some dbt jobs and then Airflow is actually just kicking off those dbt jobs? Awesome, yeah. So most of the time when I talk to customers and community members about how they do this, they'll do something like this, where they'll have some dbt models. They'll call that with the bash operator, which is a way to run a bash command with Airflow, and that'll probably power some BI dashboard somewhere, be it Looker or Sigma or what have you. There's definitely a lot of benefits to this, namely that you get all the benefits of dbt in terms of templatizing your SQL and being able to set up the right CI for that and offload all that compute into the underlying database. But there are some drawbacks in the sense that a dbt DAG is this rich DAG that kind of shows your business logic and shows how all your different models are referenced together and so on and so forth. But in Airflow, it just looks like a single task. You don't get that richness you get with dbt with Airflow using this method. I don't use dbt Cloud, so I don't know for sure if this is the case, but what I've heard secondhand is dbt Cloud makes that a little easier because it gets rid of this idea of needing to manage Python dependencies, because the dbt Cloud API is a standard HTTP API. You can just interact with it directly. But you still don't have that richness in the sense that, hey, dbt DAG over here that has 1,500 models with references and so on. In Airflow, all you kind of get is a single task that you identify with a job ID. So this debugging experience or this context loss is still there. You do get benefits, but it's not perfect just yet. One of our customers, it's this company called Updater. They're a moving service. So if you're moving, please check out Updater, shameless plug. They built something where they use Circle CI to generate the dbt manifest file, and they have a little bit of custom code that actually goes in and reads that manifest file and pops out an Airflow DAG. This is super cool because you get that rich observability and that kind of what you see with dbt right in the Airflow UI, but it can still be a little harrowing to set up the CI/CD underneath. Logging and alerting can be a mess, and you still don't get all of Airflow's first-class abstractions when using this method. Has anyone ever tried this before? Kind of parsing the manifest? Yeah. How'd it work out?
So fun.
So fun, yeah? Yeah, right? You have to you're back in CS 102 and you're writing like a graph parser and all that sort of stuff.
It's a really good test.
Yeah, it's like a nice interview exercise or something. Cool. So with all this in mind, this project we're calling Cosmos is specifically designed to make it so you can take a DAG in another system and pull it right into Airflow. It's Apache 2 licensed, so it is something that anybody can use on any instance of Airflow as long as it's 2.0 or newer. It runs everything by default in a virtual environment, so you don't have to think about Python dependencies. There is also support for Databricks workflows in Cosmos. I'm not really going to talk about today, but if you're using Databricks or you're interested by the cost savings Databricks workflows gets you, please check it out. And the best part is it works with all of those battle-tested Airflow abstractions around how you should write data pipelines. At the core, what it really does is it takes the idea of taking your DBT models, figuring out what that graph looks like, and moves that logic from a CI tool or the manifest file right inside of the Airflow worker. And by doing it in a first-class way inside of the Airflow worker, you don't have to deal with an external dependency to say that this is what my data is actually doing. Here's what my SQL references actually look like. Airflow just does that for you automatically. And then as a result of that, you get to use all the great things in Airflow around their connection management, their DAG objects, and you don't need to maintain an external CI tool. So what I wanted to do, and I left a link to this here, is I actually haven't tried demoing this live before, so if it breaks, I'm accepting it to break, but I want to kind of show you what the Japple shot demo looks like when you do it with Cosmos and data-driven scheduling. All right, let's see if I can. All right, I'm going to put the mic down while I get this set up here, and just head over to localhost. And also just spin up a terminal and see if I can make this a little bigger. CD Cosmos Dev, cool. Alrighty, let's see how. I'm only sharing my window. I'm not sharing my whole screen, no, so you can't see the terminal. Yeah. All right. Anyways, there's a terminal behind this. So here I have the Japple shop demo running. I got this running earlier this morning, so there's a couple failures piling up. The first thing I want to show is the datasets view. What you'll see is that all of the datasets that the Japple shop demo produces are expressed in a first-class way within Airflow. So you can see I'm kind of seeding my MRR playbook, the Japple shop itself, as well as what's this other one here, the attribution playbook. Right off the bat, what you're seeing is my dependencies between my workflows are defined by the underlying data sets themselves. I don't need to kind of do something else for that. And then when I go into any of my DAGs, go to this graph view here, what you'll actually see is the full DBT graph automatically parsed and kind of made for you right in the Airflow UI, all expressed as a nice task group. So I kind of click here, and you can see Japple shop jumps up here. And then going to the code a little bit, all I really had to do was point at my project, and Cosmos takes care of all the complexity. It says, hey, here's where my models are. I'm going to read them and then spit out a nice, pretty graph. And now I can do things before my DBT jobs and after my DBT jobs, all in a single UI. So all the benefits of DBT with none of the drawbacks of doing DBT inside of Airflow. I think that's all I had. Make sure I don't have my slides. Yeah.
Can you treat each node in that DBT task group as a data set?
Yep. Yeah. So I should have kind of done this a little better, but Cosmos actually automatically infers what's a data set that's going to be referred to by another model. So you can do it by yourself, but you can also, Cosmos helps with that, just by finding the references from your models directly. What it kind of does at the very core is it generates a very slimmed down version of the manifest just inside of the Airflow worker, so that Airflow can read it directly instead of relying on some external CI tool to do it.
If DBT changes the manifest, how long is it supported?
Yeah. So the nice part
is a gap between if DBT 5 and 1.5 comes out, and this is going to be supported.
Yeah. I mean, it's honestly tough to say, right? The nice part is it doesn't touch the manifest file at all. It just takes the DBT syntax and reads it itself. So unless there's major syntax changes or there shouldn't be any breaking changes going back. Obviously, if there's new syntax added, then we would have to build that ourselves. But it's been really cool to see I think this repo's been around for like a month and a half, and we've had like 60 or 70 different contributors that don't even work at Astronomer because everyone is trying to orchestrate their DBT jobs with Airflow. So I think it's kind of hitting something. So I would hope that there isn't too much lost as DBT Core releases new features.
Curious to get your thoughts on whether you think Airflow will become exposed more sort of declarative interfaces to people in the future. Because I've used tools, or I've read up on tools like DAG, which take more declarative approach to pipeline management, and you've introduced tools like, or I've seen tools like only update data set updates.
Yeah.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, and whether you think Airflow will move in that direction as well.
Yeah, so I don't think it's completely known what Airflow is going to have in its core for that, right? Well, another tool that this one we use internally called Gusty, and Gusty does exactly that. It's a declarative approach to writing Airflow DAGs, where the Gusty has its own kind of, I don't know what you would call it, like a transpiler or whatever, that says, oh, this is what your DAG should look like based on these outputs that you've set. And you still get the DAG shapes, you get the Airflow schedules, and you kind of do it upstream and downstream. And you don't have to write all Gusty DAGs, right? You can use part of your DAG in Gusty, and then another DAG can be something else, and so on and so forth. So I don't know what's going to be in Airflow Core as of right now. Like, we have a couple of things for the next two Airflow releases kind of lined up. Does there have to be something in there? Probably. What does that look like now? I'm not super sure. But I think just perusing GitHub repos, right? I've only ever looked at Gusty for this, but I'm sure somebody else already has an idea of it, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to best support that in.
How configurable is something like Cosmos? I remember one of our big motivations for doing that, like manifest parsing, creating the DAG in Airflow was to get like granular notifications and send like notification per model failure. So like what configuration?
Yeah, it's totally configurable, right? The code here kind of hides it because I'm just using this arbitrary task group object. But if I kind of dove in a little bit, you can expose the Airflow task params inside of each individual task that gets created. So you can say alert on this one, but not this one, assign a failure threshold of 3 on this one, not the other one, and so on and so forth. So it's really kind of bringing the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I have a question, not related about this feature, but I love Airflow, and the recent releases have been great, but I would say that UI is not one of its strong suits. So I'm curious, like being close to the community, do you see like getting improvement there, like cleaner UI, more intuitive interfaces?
Yeah, no, I could talk forever about this. So I think putting the data sets in its own view, right, that was definitely a step in the right direction. And then another thing we're doing on the next release is the grid view, right? So this is let me show you a better grid view here. This grid view is going to be overhauled a little bit and just give it a little more support for kind of tasks that have tasks within them, right? So it's not totally obvious what everything here is doing, and the spacing's a little off and so on and so forth. But that's a definite thing that we want to improve. I think that more high level, like what should the first thing you see in Airflow be? Should it still be the list of DAGs that you have? Should it be maybe the data sets that you have, or so on and so forth? I'm not sure what the answer is. I just know there's a lot of improvement to be made across the board. Thank you. Just go back to the right slide. Cool.
Okay, last talk of the night. That was amazing, Viraj. Thank you so much. So last talk of the night. Michelle's here. She's going to tell us about what's been happening in DBT Core. So take it away, Michelle.
That was really awesome. Both those talks. You said going third was maybe the easiest one. I don't think so. I'm Michelle. I'm a software engineer at DBT Labs, and I work on the DBT Core open source team. I've been there for about 6 months, and it's been a real pleasure getting to kind of peel back the curtain and work on the core product. Before that, I was at Shopify, rolling out DBT Core, doing like a self-managed Airflow deal at Shopify. So, yeah, That's me. And today I'm just going to kind of be like a bulletin board for what's coming up next in future versions of DBT Core, what's newer than new, coming out in 1.5 in like a month, and beyond that in terms of our roadmap. Okay, there's a bit of a lag, sorry. Okay, how many people have used DBT or are using DBT or have heard of DBT? I'm not going to do a huge intro on it. I also can't see my speaker notes, but I was just going to read off the DBT, whatever jargon we have on the marketing. It lets data teams transform data like software engineers and build data faster, more trustworthy. If you haven't seen this meme, it's one of my favorites. DBT is literally just a Ginger templater that runs your SQL in the right order. That's the primer on DBT. And now, we'll skip right ahead to what's on the bleeding edge. And the way I've sort of structured this talk is through, some of the projects that we're working on. I'll speak mostly to this first one, which we're calling multi-project deployments. It's coming out in many releases, but there's a lot of stuff coming out in 1.5 around this. And then I'll speak much more quickly to DBT as a Python library, so the DBT SDK version 0, materialized view support as a new materialization DBT, metric flow integration that's coming up, and some bonus content, whatever I found stuck in there. And then at the very end, I'll just talk about sort of how you can contribute, not just code, but ideas, feedback, emojis, upvotes, anything. Not that there's one right way to do it, but sometimes these things can be a little intimidating, and it's actually just a very warm and fuzzy group, so we love contributions. Okay, so I'm going to start with multi-project deployments. This is really near and dear to my heart. This is the project I'm working on right now at DBT Labs. And the core problem, really, maybe I can do another show of hands, is if you work in a DBT project, how many of you work in a DBT project that has more than 1,000 DBT models, or feels like it has more than 1,000 DBT models? Is it a lot of you? Not actually? Okay, well then I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff that maybe isn't so relevant, but these things are really, really hard to work in as they scale. You can just imagine for a moment that your DBT project has thousands of models, and it becomes increasingly difficult to discover anything in there, find the model that you're looking for, let alone know that it's well maintained, or who the owners are, or whether the metadata or documentation is up to date. It becomes increasingly difficult to focus on your local scope of work, so developing and testing changes made to a single model, understanding the blast radius of that, and just doing that quickly and iteratively. And lastly, it becomes really difficult to just govern the whole thing, bringing like standards in terms of data quality to this project that like hundreds of people contribute to. This is a real pain point that we had on our team running a huge monorepo with, I don't know, Stephen, tell me how many models we have now, but like 2,000, 3,000, growing rapidly, and like hundreds of data scientists, analysts running around in that repo every day. But all of this was still preferable to missing lineage. So we still wanted one big monorepo, monolith structure of this, because it's really, really convenient to be able to think about your set of knowledge had all of its connection, all of that lineage in the DAG representation. So the top level goal for this whole initiative is to enable teams to discover, build, and publish data sets they need, but without requiring every team to work in a centralized monolith, like one big DBT project, without requiring one team to act as the bottleneck for all others, and without sacrificing quality and control. And so we're calling this first phase that's coming out with a bunch of features in 1.5, really just scaling the monorepo, thinking about models as APIs. And so, I'm just going to walk through some like arts and crafts I did to demonstrate this. But the main idea is like you've got your DAG, you've got your sources, you've got your models in between, and they're working towards producing some outputs. And implicitly in large projects, there are implicit owners or teams that have built and maintained and understand the ins and outs of each model. Express their emojis, so like this bank, finance team, some tooling team, e-commerce team, I don't know. But in general, DBT is sort of like one project is this Wild West space where any model can take a dependency on any other model. You can just make a ref and start building whatever you need to build. And that's the power of like centralization, but it also can lead to some issues. If the finance team has built some model that they don't really actually want people taking dependencies on, they want to be able to change it, experiment on it, mess it up, and some other team far away they don't even talk to or know has taken that dependency, they start to be very rigid, right? Like they make a change to that finance model and it can cause breakages downstream. So the first kind of obvious thing we're adding is just this notion of like groups. You can do this with tags now. You can like tag a model to a group. We're just making it like a first-class DBT concept. The second we're adding is this idea of access modifiers. In programming, you can define interfaces to be private, public, protected. There are others. So we're bringing this kind of jargon to data models as well, where you can define what your public interfaces are and what your private models are as well. So private here are the ones that are not filled in, and they're sort of meant to be like experimental, internal to the team, where the public ones are really like your hardened interfaces that you actually want other teams to use. And we're actually doing this thing where like the ref macro explicitly won't let you ref a model that is private to another group. So if I'm in this purple shopping model and I try to take a ref dependency on a model that another group has deemed as private, ref just won't work. You won't be able to do that. Okay, so that arts and crafts is good, but let's say you take a dependency on a public model. Nothing still really stops this public model from introducing some breaking change and causing you pain later on. And so to that end, we are introducing model contracts. We're calling it model contracts, not data contracts. They're contracts that you can apply to models and have a contracted, guaranteed, stable interface between models and a DAG. And so for every column, if you define name, data types, or constraints, which I can talk a little bit more in a second, those will actually be enforced at runtime before the model is updated, before there's any processing happening. So in your schema YAML, typically that's like documentation, right? Documentation can go stale, get out of date, not actually reflect what's happening in reality. And we're really making documentation much more like metadata with this feature, where if you try to DBT run a model that doesn't conform to the schema you've defined, it just won't work. It'll break, and so your downstream consumers can trust that they have a certain shape of a data that they can work with. And aside on constraints, this is very platform specific, but generally there are things like column level, uniqueness, not null. You can have like custom constraints that's just like a SQL condition. They're kind of like DBT tests, but they don't get run after the model is built. They get run if you try to insert data into a table that's created with a constraint. So if I say this table has not null on column A, and then try to put data in it that's a null, that won't go. So it literally lets you not violate the constraint, and it's cheaper than a DBT test. There's still a place for DBT tests, but yeah, that's it, John.
So you said insert, but what like an entirely create, it would also apply that.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is what the syntax is gonna look like mostly. We're still changing the contract one for like the third time. That's okay, we get feedback and it's great. But yeah, within each column, name, data type, this is actually wrong. I'll fix that. I was gonna brag that our docs are live and we've got betas, but it's all wrong. Okay. Okay, if a model can be contracted, it can have versions. And maybe I said that wrong. If a model can be contracted, it can have breaking changes. And so we want to introduce this concept of versioning, which is really for communicating and facilitating intentional breaking changes. If you know you want to change the data type of a field from a string to an integer, and other teams assume that that's a string and now we'll break some other things, that's a breaking change. And so versioning is going to let you provide some pretty dry, do not repeat yourself, nice and slim syntax for creating a different version of the model, and let other downstream teams actually pin to a version that they know to be stable. So a downstream team can pin to the latest version sort of by default, or they can pin to version 2 so that when you release version 3, you won't break anything. So it's really giving people kind of these clear boundaries and the confidence to build to interfaces. Okay, so that lock kind of represents this like pin ref dependency. So no more unintentional or intentional breaking changes that break everyone. We're also going to add cool things like deprecation dates and windows so you can have some nice ergonomics around that. Okay, and then phase 2 is really about like taking all of these constructs, which are about scaling the monorepo and extending them to many projects. So think like cross-project refs, cross-project cycle detection, lineage, stuff like that. I won't talk too much about it because I'm still writing RFCs, and that's later. But 1.5 has all the stuff we talked about before and will be available in a month. But we are releasing betas bi-weekly now with DBT. Yeah, we're trying to keep the docs up to date as we do that as well. I think historically DBT has released beta sort of like a month before the release, and then an RC. So yeah, we're doing them bi-weekly. A lot of the stuff is in, I think basically all of it except for versions is going to be in the next beta. That's next Thursday. Okay, that's most of the talk. Now I'm just going to like hand wave around the other things that we're working on for 1.5. We are going to ship a Python SDK, just a V0. It's not going to be too fancy. Here's the GitHub discussion for it. In 1.5, it's really just going to have, you can't read that, but I'm still showing it. Yeah, in 1.5, it's going to have support for basically anything you can do with the CLI. It's going to have parity with that. So you can imagine writing a Python function that's like dbt.run. You can pass in your selection criteria as Python objects. Historically, the only interface for dbt has been the CLI. We really want to change that. One, to enable like super users and sort of integrators of dbt to do whatever they want to do and like have a much more flexible programmatic interface. And in the longer term, we want to start thinking a lot more about like plugins and extensions beyond dbt's package framework. That actually has gone really, really far. People have built really cool things. But we want you to be able to pip install plugins with dbt that supercharge it. Things like SQL linters that work natively with dbt, maybe unit testing frameworks, although that could work as a package nicely too. Different language templators, like lots of things can be plugins. This is more for, I think, the maybe like the vendor ecosystem and less for the analytics engineer directly, but pretty exciting start on that. We're also shipping support for materialized views. Who's heard of a materialized view before? Cool, okay. So yeah, DBT is getting a new materialization. It's like been around for a while, and I think it only has 4, right? Table, view, ephemeral, incremental. So a 5th one is kind of exciting. And yeah, I think in 1.5 we're gonna have support for, I put this in my notes and I forgot. I'm not working on this too, this is more the adapters team. But I think it's BigQuery, Postgres, and Redshift for 1.5. And 1.6 will have us thinking a lot more about how DBT tests apply to something like a materialized view. You don't really want like a snapshot in time test. You want to know exactly when your data has violations to any data quality checks you may have written. I'm showing these discussions partially because I'm going to talk about how to contribute, and sort of this is going to lead into it. But yeah, a lot of our features basically map to a GitHub discussion, and it's definitely a free-for-all for people to chime in or ask questions of how this might work. Okay, this was kind of a big one. A metric flow integration. Does anyone use metric flow? Okay, then I'll go really quick. But DBT Labs is like kind of a small company, and we acquired another small company called Transform. And at its core, the two companies are pretty aligned in that they are like open core. They've got this open source metric definition tool and framework that also generates pretty sophisticated queries to provide a semantic layer. So there will be a metric flow integration built into DBT. Don't exactly know what the shape of that will be yet. It's pretty early days, stay tuned. But you can expect a facelift to the DBT metrics specification and that package to get a lot more mature and robust. Bonus content, grab bag of some things. I just wanted to like call out some cool stuff that external contributors have shipped. Small things and big things, little quality of life, paper cut improvements here and there. You know the like version 2 on the schema.yaml that you always have to write? It's optional in 1.5, rejoice. We also have wildcard selection. So if you want to do like DBT select anything that has revenue in it, that will start working. That was a really nice community suggestion. And in general, I kind of mentioned this, we're thinking more about pluggability, extensibility. We did this exercise where we just surveyed the interfaces we've already got and realized that DBT docs generation, docs serve, should really be pluggable. And DBT docs is really one implementation so far of that pluggable interface. We're kind of going to prove this out, I think, by, I don't know the right words here, but like by giving it away more and more to the community. So if there are some expert designers or JS people or front-end people, like contributions, welcome. And I think we're definitely going to be looking for people to take more of an active role in its ownership and maintenance within the community. And so speaking of contributing, here are some friendly suggestions on how you can contribute to the overall project if you'd like to. I think there's sort of three main ways: ideas, code, and feedback. If you have ideas, and these are all linked, I tried to put a lot of links in, check out the GitHub discussions. These are long-lived, we'll never close these. You can take a look at what's already there, and if you've got something original that you'd like to see discussed, please pop it in there. And this applies to any DBT Labs, DBT prefix repo, or DBT core. So yeah, feel free to open these, feel free to drop a comment, feel free to upvote stuff. It actually really, really helps. Like I said, a lot of our big features map one-to-one with discussions. And for many of these, they're really, really iterative refinement processes with the community. We just did a really fun one around model versions, trying to get the spec right, having people try it out and just chime in on big and small things. That was really fun. Some notable features that came from discussions are Python models. The model contracts actually came out of a different discussion. We realized that's the thing we wanted to build from it. Model versions, that spec that will ship soon, was really being refined there. I opened a unit testing one like 3 years ago, so hopefully one day I'll implement that there. Column level lineage, lots of stuff. You can also open kind of smaller scoped feature issues. We've got some templates for that. Those go into triage sort of right away, and usually within 1 to 2 days, core maintainer will come in to refine, ask some more questions, and see if we want to prioritize this. Here are some of this is just like the discussions view. If you care about the future of VARs, inline model documentation. Oh yeah, I think people wanted to put in, like you can define YAML in the .SQL file. Discussions there, model contracts versions, lots of fun active discussions. And I made a slide about this like feature template. There's a template, it's pretty well scoped. Even if you don't want to contribute it, you can suggest something and it goes into triage. And we've got a pretty mature system of triaging those things and responding. So genuinely look forward to seeing what people come up with. In terms of contributing code, if you're a first-time contributor and you just want to jump in, look for the good first issue label. We've got 12 open as of an hour ago. Those are sort of like approachable, good first issues. If you are interested, just chime in and say, is anyone working on this? I can try it out. There's no expectation or pressure, but we try to categorize these so that they're more approachable. And if you're more familiar with the project or maybe with Python, check out the help wanted label. Those are basically issues that have been refined enough that it's pretty clear what we want to build. We're just looking for someone to help out. Yeah. And we, the core team, hang out in the Slack community channel, DBT Core Development. So if you're working on something and you want some help, feel free to reach out there. Last but not least, for sure, is feedback. And we honestly get a lot of feedback, which is really nice. There are a lot of excited community members with feedback. You can open bug or regression issues. Feel free to chime in on discussions or any issues with that refinement label where we're like figuring out what we want to do with this. Even if you're just weighing in on naming, naming is hard. And yeah, please weigh in. Or upvoting something someone said, leaving emoji reactions to something someone said. It's actually really, really helpful. We genuinely want to build the right things here, and I think people at DBT really care about like ergonomics and UX. So I don't think there's any like bit of too pedanticness you can have in that. And lastly, now that we're doing biweekly betas, test them out. If you switch your local setup requirements to the beta version. You can run whatever you're running with DBT locally. If you find any regressions or issues, just make a regression issue. And we get a lot of that already, but for those that don't know, these are some ways that you can provide feedback. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you. I know I gave a whirlwind of like a lot of things, so if you want to talk after about any of the features, we can go in depth for sure. Should I take questions, or are we out of time?
Why don't we save questions for
Okay.
after?
Yeah, just because we are running up on time. But yeah, that was amazing. Another round of applause for all of our speakers. Whew. All right. Oh my God, we made it. We made it. That was good. So just 40 more seconds of your time. First off, as always, we're looking for speakers. If you've done anything interesting at work, implemented a cool project, or have you exploring a new technology, or you have had some, really interesting theoretical stuff that you want to talk about, just hit me or Lindsay up, and we'd love to feature you at one of the next couple meetups. And finally, I would appreciate if everybody in the room right now took out your phone and scan this QR code, and I'm actually watching everyone in this room too, so I can see if you do it. But yeah, we would really, really love if you filled out this survey form. It only takes a few minutes. It's super easy, and it helps us, bring you guys more content that you like in future meetups. And yeah, I think that's it. The next meetup is May 4th. And that's going to be at 111. It's going to be a banger. I think for now, we'll wrap up here in the office, and we will be going out for drinks at the Friar, which is just down the street. So feel free to make your way over there. They know that we're coming, don't worry about just mobbing them. And yeah, again, thanks a lot for everybody coming, and this was a great event. Cool.